What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today we have got our Week 12 fantasy wide receiver starts and sits for every single matchup. So make sure to tune in. And if you guys enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe, and also give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us as the week progresses. Shoot us your questions there. We'll make sure to answer them. And also check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Sign up for our free newsletter to get access to exclusive content. All the details in the description. But in the meantime, let's get right into it. Before getting into our breakdowns, I want to give you guys a quick word from our sponsors at Overlay Fantasy Sports, who are taking DFS to a whole nother level. And I specifically want to highlight their matchup shop function, which is an absolute blast. In fact, we've been using it since the start of the NFL season because, let's face it, betting on the same old Team A versus Team B can get a little bit stale, a little bit boring. Well, that's not even close to being the case with the matchup shop of Overlay Fantasy, as it allows you to bet on individual player matchups, and it's super simple. Just pick whichever player you think will have the higher fantasy performance. And just like a regular bet would work, check out the spreads, do your research, and then win some money. You can bet on pretty much any single sport that you want, whether it's NFL, golf, MLB, etc. All those options are there. And again, super simple. Pretty much for any single NFL game coming up, you've got a bunch of different matchups that are always updated and added to. So if it's something as simple as just putting a single submission, you can do that. But guess what? If you want to get a parlay going and double up some of those winnings, you can do that as well. So take advantage of this. All of that homework you're doing for your fantasy lineups, let's have that translate to some big time winnings for your wallet as well. So do yourself a favor and check out Overlay Fantasy's matchup shop now. Our first game of the week on Thursday features the Houston Texans at the Detroit Lions. And as far as wide receivers, let's start with the easy bid here and look at Houston. Will Fuller and Brandon Cooks, you fire up this duo. Fuller does have the slightly higher ceiling, but Brandon Cooks is a decent low-end wide receiver to mid-level wide receiver to even on the week when you consider this woeful Detroit defense. And for that reason, we feel very confident starting both these guys as they will have relatively high floors on the week. While for the Detroit Lions, a little bit trickier because this short turnaround might mean a jeopardized starting status for Kenny Golladay as he missed this last week as well. Obviously, if he's available, you start him. That's relatively simple. If not, Marvin Jones is the guy that you continue to plug in. He's been the most reliable guy after Kenny Golladay. Maybe Danny Amendola, similar to a Kenny Golladay, but he also missed this last week. If you're desperate, Amendola could be a decent PPR start if you play. And then as far as our sits, one name here we want to mention, Keke Coutee for the Houston Texans. Yes, he had a touchdown this last week and Randall Cobb banged up, but again, we think this could be a game plan where it's mainly Fuller and Cooks, and then especially if the Houston Texans were ever to get their rushing attack going, it would be versus Detroit. So for that reason, Coutee becomes more of a riskier pick. We would sit him. Looking at Washington and the Cowboys next, we're starting Terry McLaurin. That's relatively simple. He has got low-end wide receiver one, upside pretty much every single week. It all just depends how much Washington airs it out, and we expect versus this Cowboys defense that it will be a stable amount. While for Dallas, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because this Washington defense not as weak overall as that of the Minnesota Vikings. So we're actually only willing to take a chance on one of these wide receivers, as the rushing attack here probably won't have as much success as it did last week, which will have a trickle-down effect on the quarterback play and on the wide receivers. So Cooper, due to volume, probably going to be the most reliable guy here, but I would put whichever Cowboys wide receiver, honestly, you look at as a low-end wide receiver to, at best, McLaurin, the much better option here. So due to that reason, Michael Gallup and CeeDee Lamb are listed as sits. I think this is just too tough of a matchup here to expect two fantasy-relevant wide receivers from the Cowboys. Next, Ravens at the Steelers, and honestly, I'd be willing to start every single Pittsburgh wide receiver here. Now, with the caveat that Juju Smith-Schuster plays because he did get nicked up towards the end of last week, stepping on a flag of all things. But that's the situation. It's a short turnaround. Maybe the Steelers decide to play it safe. If that's the case, Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool obviously still starts. Deontay Johnson has the higher ceiling of all of these guys, so he's practically a wide receiver, low-end wide receiver one every single week, especially with his target share. We like the Steelers wide receivers here. Cannot say the same thing for the Baltimore Ravens group because Marquise Brown has been one of the biggest disappointments this season, and we continue to say how boom or bust he is. He's not really relevant in PPR formats. We had him as a sit last week, so we continue to treat it this way. This Baltimore offense, with the way Lamar Jackson is airing it out, not all that many passing yards, and looking at the tight ends first, we're fading all of these wide receivers. This is a great Steelers defense, in case you guys have forgotten. Willie Snead and Des Bryant, who made an appearance last week, we are sitting them all. Afterwards, Panthers at the Vikings. Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore are solid starts here versus this bad Vikings secondary. Whether it's Teddy Bridgewater under center, which is what we currently expect, which is partially the reason why we have Curtis Samuel as a sit. Yes, he did have a very nice week in week 11. Saw a lot of targets with PJ Walker under center, but if Teddy Bridgewater returns, we think that Curtis Samuel will go down on that pecking order, and it'll be Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore primarily like it's been all season long, and Curtis Samuel just becomes too touchdown dependent. While for the Vikings, this is where it gets difficult because Adam Thielen was placed on the COVID list. So the early expectation, I should say, is that he does not play. But if he somehow does, which is a long shot, obviously, but I'm not sure how that situation plays out, you obviously start him. If not, Justin Jefferson has an extremely high ceiling on the week, and he is a viable low-end wide receiver one, even with his rookie status. While the sit here for the Viking side is Olabisi Johnson. You know, he's kind of that wide receiver 3, and you might make a case that without Adam Thielen, he could be a decent plug-and-play guy, but I just believe that for the Vikings, this will be a focal point in terms of the rushing attack and how to replace Adam Thielen, looking at those two tight ends in Irv Smith and Rudolph. So for that reason, I would be fading Olabisi Johnson here regardless. Moving on, we've got the Chargers at the Bills. I like the wide receiver group here in general for both these teams, Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. Keenan Allen continues to get all the targets in the world. I think this will be a high scoring affair, so I've got faith in both sides. The one thing that I will say, keep this in mind. Once Austin Eckler returns, we don't know whether it'll be this week or next week, but when it does happen, expect those targets for Keenan Allen to go down. Now, again, he's still going to be a wide receiver one, especially in PPR formats, but just keep that in mind. While for the Buffalo Bills, Stephon Diggs, Cole Beasley, John Brown. Diggs has the highest ceiling as that low-end wide receiver one. Then you got Cole Beasley, John Brown. I think, again, in what should be a high-scoring affair with two quarterbacks that can sling the football, Beasley and John Brown have got low-end to mid-level wide receiver 2 upside on the week. Next up, Cardinals at the Patriots. For the Cardinals, mainly interested in DeAndre Hopkins, probably to nobody's surprise. He's obviously a must-start every single week, the highest ceiling out of any of these other wide receivers. Then for the Patriots, Damiere Byrd and Jacoby Myers. This one will be interesting. More than likely, what we would suggest doing here is tracking the expected coverage with Patrick Peterson here, because more than likely, that will end up being a situation where it takes out one of these options, and then the remaining guy will probably be the better start. That's how we would treat this situation. So keep an eye out for that, any of those reports coming out in the future. But we just think that both Byrd and Myers right now are better options than N'Keal Harry, who we have as a sit. Looking at volume, looking at targets and opportunities in PPR settings. Yes, Byrd is coming off a huge game, but I wouldn't necessarily treat that as the only reason to just start him. Again, I think this will come down to matchups, and I still tend to believe that this Patriots offense cannot sustain 2 fantasy relevant wide receivers. So this is more so of a situation to get you guys aware of the coverages in this matchup defensively and to keep a track on that. As far as the Cardinals, I'm sitting Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald. I just don't think that we're going to see all that much consistency from these guys. Yes, Fitzgerald is coming off a big game in terms of targets, but this Patriots defense, I think it will rattle Kyler Murray a little bit, and we might see a lower scoring game from Murray than we expect. Kirk, like we said before, too boom or bust, so we would fade him as well. Next up, Dolphins at the Jets. For the Dolphins, whether it's Tua under center or Fitzpatrick, obviously the coaches have come out and said it'll be Tua for this upcoming week, but regardless, Devontae Parker is the most trustworthy wide receiver here. You could consider other options, but we just think that this will be a situation where it's either Parker or Gesicki, or just probably a focus on the rushing attack, considering the matchup versus the Jets, that your other options aren't really all that viable for Miami as far as wide receiver is concerned. Then for the Jets, Jamison Crowder, Brashad Perriman, the 2 guys that we would be starting, both solid PPR plays. Yes, Crowder's coming off a down week, but he is still a reliable wide receiver. Probably with Joe Flacco under center, lower ceiling, but regardless, the opportunities will be there. We think both guys are low to mid-level wide receiver 2s. Next up, we've got the Giants at the Bengals. For the Giants, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton, we think they are slightly more reliable than Golden Tate, especially when you consider the targets and the opportunities that they are getting. Darius Slayton has that higher ceiling, but maybe a little bit riskier than Sterling Shepard, who's probably just a little bit more reliable, safer, but not as huge of an upside. While for the Bengals, this is where it gets tough, unfortunate. When's the last time we only had one Cincinnati Bengals wide receiver listed as a start? Well, that's probably going to become a trend now with Joe Burrow out for the year. And for that reason, we're listing the guy that we have the most confidence in here to be, the number 1 wide receiver for Cincinnati going forward. We think that's Boyd, but the ceiling for him is not nearly as high, regardless of who the Cincinnati Bengals choose to start under center. Hasn't necessarily been announced yet, so keep that in mind. But either way, the upside for these wide receivers, AJ Green and T. Higgins, who we have listed as sits now, has absolutely plummeted. So this has kind of become a situation to possibly avoid as wide receivers for the Bengals are concerned. And then, like we mentioned before, Golden Tate, a little bit too risky, especially in a game where you could see the rushing attack have its say. So we have got him as a sit. Moving on, Titans at the Colts. I'd start A.J. Brown and Corey Davis here. I think this will be a situation where the Titans have more success than they did versus the Colts the first time they played just a couple of weeks ago. And Corey Davis and A.J. Brown, probably similar type of opportunities, similar type of upsides. A.J. Brown does have the higher probability, I would say, in terms of capitalizing on touchdown success. So that's why I have him ranked higher, but I expect this to be a high-scoring game. That's why I think Corey Davis is also a decent start. While for the Colts, this is tough. I'd probably go with Michael Pittman Jr. like we currently have it listed, but Zach Pascal, T.Y. Hilton currently as sits, just not enough faith in this wide receiver core and in Phillip Rivers. Just spreading it out a lot to those running backs, to those tight ends. So I look at the guy that has the highest upside. To me, that's Michael Pittman. Pascal and T.Y. Hilton, probably are going to go for like 4 to 5 receptions. Not saying that Michael Pittman won't, but to me, he's got higher touchdown upside. That's why he is a start for me. Afterwards, Browns at the Jaguars. Jarvis Landry, pretty much the only wide receiver that I trust for Cleveland, and this is a decent matchup versus the Jaguars. I expect better weather conditions, so I think the ceiling is higher for Landry this week as opposed to last week. While for the Jaguars, with Luton under center, it's been Shark, and then it's also quietly been Keelan Cole. I think this is a better matchup than what they faced versus the Steelers. So if you need a flyer, I think Keelan Cole is a decent option to look at as a low-end wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3 candidate. And then for the Browns, Rashard Higgins, we have him listed as a sit because this will primarily be a rushing attack for the Browns featured versus this pretty bad Jaguars defense. Honestly, anytime you can lighten the load for Baker Mayfield and he doesn't have to do as much, you'll take that opportunity. So that's why I think the passing attack here after Jarvis Landry isn't all that much to get excited about. Then Raiders at the Falcons. I'll start Nelson Aguilar. Look, it's going to be a situation with the Raider wide receivers where it's up and down, where it's not as consistent, but we think that Aguilar is the highest ceiling wide receiver out of the bunch. And versus this bad Falcons defense, we don't mind starting him here as actually probably a high-end wide receiver too. Then for Atlanta, Julio Jones, if he plays with a nagging hamstring, yet again, you start him. If not, Calvin Ridley. And afterwards, Russell Gage might be a name that people throw out, but honestly, I'm not interested in this Falcons offense other than Ridley with Julio Jones being out. So I would be sitting Russell Gage. And then Hunter Renfrow, Henry Ruggs, they're the other names in this wide receiver core for the Raiders. But I just, again, don't think they have as much upside as Nelson Aguilar. And when you compare them to Darren Waller, who's pretty much the main wide receiver on this team, even though he's a tight end, again, I think they fall under him. And then I think this could be, lastly, a game where we see a lot of Josh Jacobs, maybe even Devonta Booker. So for that reason, fading Renfrow and Ruggs. Afterwards, Saints at the Broncos. I'm starting Michael Thomas, but a little bit of a heads up to those getting excited about Taysom Hill under center. After watching a good amount of that game between the Saints and the Falcons, a couple things to point out. This won't be a situation where Taysom Hill benefits from playing the Atlanta defense every single week. And we still think he has limitations as a passer. Also, let's not expect that Alvin Kamara will pretty much catch no passes going forward. He's going to get re-involved in the passing attack. So for that reason, I'm only looking at Michael Thomas here. Emmanuel Sanders, a little bit too risky. I don't trust the volume, and I still don't trust the quarterback versus better defenses. While for Denver, Jerry Jeudy and Tim Patrick, yes, this is a tough Saints defense. It's kind of up and down and inconsistent, but Jeudy and Tim Patrick are the two guys for the Broncos that I would go with. So for that reason, I think that they're probably both low-end wide receiver 2s, high-end wide receiver 3s. KJ Hamler is the odd man out. I think he's even lower in terms of upside. So that's how I view this matchup with the Saints and Broncos. Going to the 49ers and Rams next, I actually like the two duos here as starts Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. Look, still no George Kittle, and potentially we might see Raheem Mostert back, but as far as wide receivers to start, I trust Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel returning. He's got that high upside, maybe a little bit more boom or bust, but in standard type of formats, not a bad play. While for the Rams, Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods, again, we continue to say it every single week in PPR formats, both very solid wide receiver 2s as far as flow is concerned, and then even higher ceiling like we saw this last week. Then Chiefs at the Buccaneers. Only Chiefs wide receiver that I can confidently start every single week is Tyreek Hill. No surprise there. For the Bucs, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown. I would start the trio of these wide receivers. I think, this is going to be a situation where the Bucs have to air it out a lot. So we might see a similar type of distribution like we did versus the Rams with these three wide receivers. Evans has the highest touchdown upside. Godwin as kind of that safe PPR guy. And then Antonio Brown also kind of trending in that direction. I think that all these guys, when they get involved and used properly, are probably mid-level wide receiver 2s. That's how I would treat them when they are all healthy and playing. And then for the Chiefs, I would sit Mecole Hardman. Again, a situation where I believe he is just too boom or bust to trust. Afterwards, Bears at Packers. For the Bears, Allen Robinson. Despite the fact that the Bears are injured at the quarterback position, Robinson will still be heavily involved in this offense, and I think that volume will save him. So for that reason, I would take a chance on him, but I'm viewing him as a low to mid-level wide receiver 2. For the Packers, not a shocker. Davante Adams is the guy that you want to start, even versus a tough Bears defense. I think Davante Adams is a wide receiver 1. However, our sits, Lazard and MVS for Green Bay, I don't think they are as matchup proof as Davante Adams. This is, again, a situation where they'll probably have a harder time versus this Bears defense than Davante Adams, so I'm fading them. And then for the Bears, Anthony Miller, Darnell Mooney, we continue to say there's only one fantasy-relevant wide receiver on this team. It's Robinson, or I should say there can only be one fantasy-relevant wide receiver on this team due to the quarterback situation, which we still don't really know who's going to start due to injuries, Trubisky, Foles, maybe even somebody else. So I'm fading the other Chicago wide receivers. And then finally, Seahawks at the Eagles, Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf. They're both fine starts. We like the upside for them, kind of in that mid to high end wide receiver 2 range. Floor-wise at worst, and then obviously wide receiver 1 ceiling. While for the Eagles, I actually think this could be a decent game for the wide receivers considering the Seattle Seahawks secondary. Rieger would be my preferred choice, but I wouldn't be shocked to see Fulgham kind of return from the dead here after his last 2 weeks where it's been very disappointing. As long as he gets the targets like he did last week, I think that he can have a successful outing. I think both these guys, obviously lower on the totem pole than Lockett and Metcalf, but probably in the low-end wide receiver 2 category. And then to me, a sit, Alshon Jeffrey. Yes, a big name, but he's kind of that odd man out, so I would sit him. So with that, we wrap up this week 12 wide receiver start and sit breakdown. And as always, let us hear it in the comment section. Did you agree, disagree, along with any other start or sit questions you guys might have? We will do our best to answer them. And if you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Also, give us a follow on Twitter at AllDayPigskin to continue interacting with us as the week progresses and sending us your questions there as well. We make sure to answer all of those. And lastly, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. Sign up for a free newsletter to get access to exclusive content, all those details in the description. But for now, we'll see you guys in future videos.